Hey everyone, I'm Heather from bostongirlbakes.com, and today I want to show you how to make a homemade pie crust from scratch. I hear from a lot of new bakers that they're very intimidated to make a pie crust from scratch, but I want to give you all the confidence in the world today with this video, giving you all my tips and tricks so you can rock out a flaky and buttery pie crust in your own kitchen. So let's get started. Let me show you how to make pie crust completely from scratch. To start by making our pie crust from scratch, we just need 5 simple ingredients here that I've got measured out. First is 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. Next we have our salt. It's a teaspoon here of fine sea salt. You can use kosher salt or table salt if that's what you have as well. Next we have our 2 fats. I have here equal parts unsalted butter and vegetable shortening. If you're new to making pie crust, I highly recommend making a pie crust that uses both butter and shortening. Although I love making a pie crust with all butter, I find it can be a little bit more difficult to work with. I've simply cubed these up and I keep them in the freezer for about an hour before I start making my pie crust. And the reason I like using some butter is obviously for the flavor. Nothing beats the flavor of butter in your pie crust. But it does have a lower melting point, so I find it can be a little bit more difficult to work with, and it softens much more quicker than if you're using some vegetable shortening. Vegetable shortening is 100% fat. There is no water in there, and so it can be a bit more crumblier of a crust. There is no flavor to it as well, so I don't recommend using all shortening. But because of its higher melting point, it's a little bit more easier to work with, and it doesn't soften as quickly as if you were to use butter. So if you're new to making pie crust, this is the best of both worlds, and it's going to make a nice easy pie crust for you to make and roll out. And the last ingredient we need is some ice cold water. I simply measured out about a cup of water. This is way more water than we're going to need, but I placed in a few ice cubes to keep it nice and cold, and I keep that in my fridge until I'm ready to use. I'm making my pie crust by hand today in a mixing bowl, and I'm going to be using a pastry cutter to work the butter and shortening into the flour, but I'll also show you how to make it with simply your hands if you don't have a pastry cutter. You can also make this same recipe in a food processor or even in your stand mixer with a paddle attachment or what's called a pastry cutter attachment, which I'll link to below. So we're adding in first our flour, then I'm adding in the salt. I'm simply just going to give this a whisk to combine. Then we're going to add in our fats. You want these cold and cubed, so I'm starting with the butter. I like to give it a toss first with my hands to simply coat it so it doesn't get as stuck in the pastry cutter. And this is called the cutting in method because we're going to be what's called cutting the butter into the flour by using this pastry cutter. We're going to be pressing down with the pastry cutter, and we're simply working the butter into smaller pieces. You still want visible pieces of fat in the end. You shouldn't see like a smooth dough. You want to see those visible pieces of butter in the dough. Simply pressing down with my pastry cutter and rocking it back and forth to get those big chunks of butter broken down into smaller pieces. They should be about the size of peas. You're going to have some bigger pieces and some smaller pieces. They're not going to be all the same size. If you don't have a pastry cutter, what you can simply do is take your hands, use just your fingertips, and take those pieces of butter and simply smush them in between your fingertips. One tip I have for you, to find those chunks of butter that still need to be worked, simply give the bowl a shake, and you're going to see some of those bigger chunks float to the top for you to find and continue to squish. It's like mining for butter. I'm just kind of fishing through to make sure I've got all of the big chunks worked in. Now once I've added the butter in, I'm going to do the same thing with the shortening. So now we're going to add in our ice cold water. We're going to do this 1 tablespoon at a time. I've obviously got way more water than I need. You're going to find that with every pie crust recipe, it's going to call for a varying amount of water. You always want to start with the lowest amount and add a tablespoon at a time. The amount of water that you add is going to depend on how much the fat was worked into the flour. So every time you even make the same pie crust recipe, you're going to find that the amount of water can vary each time. So I'm just starting with a tablespoon of water, And I'll just stir that in. This recipe calls for about 6 to 8 tablespoons, but sometimes I find that it is on the higher end. It just kind of depends. So start by sprinkling a tablespoon of water in it each time, giving it a stir. Again, you want the water to be ice cold so it keeps the fat nice and cold. So in the bowl, it's not going to quite look like pie crust. It's not going to come together, and we don't want it to come together into the bowl. That means it's over mixed, overworked, and too much water has been added. We want to do what's called the squeeze test to see if we've added enough. So it won't look like it's come together in the bowl, but if we give it a squeeze, it should hold together in our hands. So if you take some of the dough and you squeeze it in your hands, you can see how it holds together. It doesn't seem like that in the bowl, but once I hold it in my hands and give it a squeeze, I can see that it has come together into a nice pie dough. I still see those visible pieces of fat. So this is the perfect amount of water that I've added. Again, yours might vary, so use the squeeze test as the determining factor as to whether or not you've added enough water. So now we're going to bring the dough together into discs of dough. To bring our dough together, this is my tea towel trick that I have found works really great for bringing the dough together into one cohesive mass. I'm just spreading out a clean tea towel onto my surface, and I'm simply going to dump the dough into the center. This will also be a great way to determine if your dough is still a little bit dry and needs a little extra water. And I'm just going to bring up the edges of the towel like a beggar's purse. And I'm simply going to give it a twist, and this is going to bring the dough together inside into one ball of nice, neat dough. So your dough should come together into this nice, neat ball of dough. If it's a little bit dry and falls apart on you, you can sprinkle on a little bit more water and work in the extra water. You know, just go slowly with it. Don't add a lot, just add a little bit at a time. What I like to do though is laminate my dough at this point. This is something I've started doing recently, just like if I was to make puff pastry or biscuits, to create a really flaky pie crust. So what I like to do is simply just, it also helps with bringing the pie dough together. So I simply smush it in half, and now you can either cut it in half or simply fold it in half, and then I just place that on top and place it together. Again, you can use that tea towel to kind of smush it together nice and easily. And what we're doing is creating those layers of pie crust. And you can cut it in half or just simply divide it in half, smush it in half, and again, I'm just smushing it in half. I do this 3 times. I don't want to do it too many times. I don't want to overwork my dough, but I have found that this extra added step really creates such a flaky pie crust, just like when I make biscuits. So I'm going to go ahead and divide my dough in half. Now you can weigh it if you want to make it exact. I'm going to simply eyeball this, and we want to wrap it in plastic wrap at this point. I want to start my pie crust in a nice round shape because that's how we're going to be rolling it out. So do yourself a favor and start it in a nice round shape so it's easier to roll out. So I'm just shaping it into a circle, and I want to flatten it out. Again, it's just going to give us a head start when we go to roll out the dough. We're going to wrap each disc of dough into some plastic wrap, and we're going to chill these in the fridge for 1 hour. It's going to help firm up the fat. More importantly, it's going to help the gluten in the flour relax. Now, the gluten is the protein that forms in the flour once the flours become hydrated. If we were to roll it out right now, it's going to be more difficult to roll out. The gluten needs a chance to relax. Otherwise, it's like kind of rolling out a rubber band. It's just going to keep stretching back and forth on us and kind of fighting us. So give your pie dough a chance to chill in the fridge for 1 hour before you proceed with rolling out your pie crust. So there you go, homemade pie crust in minutes. Be sure to check out the rest of my videos in this pie crust series for perfect pie crust this holiday season.